Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have you here at the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. As folks enter the waiting room, let's just orient ourselves to where we are. Today it is Tuesday at 12:30 p.m., and you have found yourself in the afternoon session, Tenant Power for a Green Future, looking at immigrant-led efforts towards sustainability, community-controlled housing. And today's session is sponsored by Universal Healthcare Foundation of Connecticut. So thank you so much for the support for this session and the conference overall. We do have a little bit of housekeeping today for interpretation support services for this session. So I'm going to pass it over to Juanita to explain a little bit more about that, and then we'll dive into today's conversation. Thanks you so much for being here.
Thank you, Danielle. Hi, everybody. My name is Juanita Jalepas. I'll be your simultaneous interpreter this wonderful afternoon. I ask that you please select your
Mhm.
language unless you are bilingual. But if not, please select the language because we will be going into both languages. If you have any issues using the interpretation function, please put it in the chat so we can help you out. And we ask that if you are not speaking, please keep your microphones off. And if you are, please mind your pace and your volume. Thank you very much. Hola a todo el mundo. Y un mensaje para los hispanohablantes. Esta sesión va a ser interpretada simultáneamente al español. Yo soy Juanita, voy a interpretarles todo lo que se dice. Cuando aparezca el globo en la parte inferior de sus pantallas, por favor, acuérdense de seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia. Si nos acompañan de un celular o de una tableta, van a ver 3 puntos en una de las esquinas. Ahí pueden tocar los 3 puntos y seleccionar interpretación y después su idioma. Por favor, recuerden de mantener sus micrófonos apagados si no están hablando y si van a hablar, por favor, acuérdense de hablar despacio y para poder interpretar todo lo que se está diciendo. Si tienen algún problema con la función de interpretación, por favor, pónganos una notica en el chat para poder ayudarlos. Muchas gracias y que tengan una buena reunión. Thank you, Daniel. I'm ready to be assigned now.
All right, over to you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Quintana. I am a community organizer from Magdeburg, Connecticut, and we are here to learn the tenants' power for justice um, for our immigrants community and for a green future. I will share my presentation, and we're going to be with some presenters with us, like Micaela Arenas, Chelsea Corning from Connecticut Fair Housing Center, Gabriela Moncada, a wonderful community leader from Magdeburg, Connecticut, and hopefully we're going to have Victor Avila with us as well. So let me share my presentation. As undocumented immigrants, we find ourselves living temporarily as when we arrived to this country. Many of the people that I met during all this time, when we arrived, myself, I am from Bolivia. When I arrived, I have to sleep in a couch for many months. And many people in my community should be like sharing apartments sometimes, and they have to live in just rooms, entire families of four, trying to survive the first couple months. And I hear many people sleeping on the porch without heater, and that's why we want to find a stable housing without documentation is a little like complicated. Applying for housing is not a choice without a credit history and, oh, I'm sorry, or income tax record in the US. It takes around 6 months after arrival for an undocumented immigrant to seek out housing. During this time, undocumented immigrants may find themselves unhoused if their housing situation upon arrival is not reliable. Living in a couch in a friend house is actually being unhoused, and sometimes people don't talk about this. Finding a safe place. Finding establishing a home as an immigrant is a big challenge. This is because, as I said before, the application fees every single times. That is something that I have been hearing from my community, that every single times as they have to apply for apartments, they have to pay a fee to their realtors. And this is like causing a lot of instability in their income every month. And it's obviously most expensive for them to find a house right now. It's not just how high the rent it is, that this is another issue, but actually the process to find a house, like paying the application fees. The other issue is the language justice, because every single times when they have to find a house, they have to speak with somebody who actually doesn't speak the language that they speak. Many times they have to sign contracts that they actually don't understand, and sometimes they can criminalize themselves signing or going against them signing a contract that actually is not in their language. And there is a lot of xenophobia because, of course, on the times that we are living right now, there is so many people who actually have anti-immigrants feelings. There is a lot of discrimination because sometimes I hear people in my community stating that because they have kids, they don't want to rent a apartment for them. Many of these families actually says that it's inhuman to tell their kids that they don't have to like walk, that they have to not, they can't talk in their apartments, because sometimes the people just don't want them to, they don't want to renew their contract because they don't want kids in their houses. Then the other issues is the lack of credit history. As I says, of course, when you come from another country, you don't have the credit history. And when they request a credit, to check your credit, of course, you have to give a social security number. When you don't have social security number, some realtor or landlord who actually are take advantage of our community, they charge more than three security deposit. And we know that that is illegal here in Connecticut, that they only have to ask for two security deposit, but they always says it's because you don't have a credit history, and that's why you have to pay that amount of money. Even though they are very wonderful renters, that they take care of the property and they actually pay their rent on time. The other issue is that because they are underpaid and low income communities, of course, they are not, they find these places where are almost like uninhabitable. They are very dirty places with a lot of cockroach and a lot of, as I'm gonna show you after, that our community are living in those places. And sometimes they have to work double or triple for them to afford to pay rent. But actually, if they are working more than 10 hours or 12 or 14 hours a day, they not even have a time to organize, and they cannot like go and find justice for them and their families. This is our real pictures that I took as I was like walking with my community and knowing what their conditions were. So you can see that they have been living with mold, cockroach, rats. Uh, when they ask for maintenance, they usually tell them that they have to cover them. They don't have safety places. There's the pictures in the middle is a back door. Many times they were opened by people from the outside, and they never feel secure. And of course, the cables are completely um, without any safety, and our community are living in these kind of conditions. And you are like, you will ask me how much they are paying. Well, they are paying the same amount of money that every single people is paying in Hartford. If those apartments are from with one bedroom, they are paying $1,200, and because they don't have credit history and they have a necessity to find a place where they can call home, they have to take these kind of places where to live. Do they deserve this? Of course not, because we all are humans and we deserve to live in better conditions. And I will pass it now to my wonderful friend, Chelsea from Connecticut Fair Housing Center.
Thank you, Teresa. So as Teresa said, I work for the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. I work with tenants who are organized or organizing, and so I work very closely with Make the Road and a lot of their members. And I just wanted to, reiterate that a lot of this is rooted in those tenants' lived experiences, right? We are contextualizing what people are living through and living with every day. And so those conditions that Teresa is mentioning that the tenants are dealing with, this is a function of our predatory landlording system that allows people to put profit over people, right? And the slumlord, predatory landlords, we've always had these types of property owners in the US, but in recent years, we've seen this manifest in the form of like corporate, out of state landlords coming in, buying up properties. Um, and this issue has been exacerbated over recent decades within the context of the financialization of the rental market, which might sound like a wonky term, but it's truly fundamental to the conditions that we are all living in. And I'll expand on that in a moment. But for now, we can think of financialization as structural changes in housing markets and finance markets, um, and even global investment, where housing is treated as a commodity, as a means of accumulating wealth, oftentimes as security for financial instruments that are traded and sold on global markets. So it refers to the way capital investment in housing is increasingly disconnecting housing from its social function of providing a place for a human being to live um, in security and dignity, and undermines the realization of housing as a human right. So it's referring to the way that housing and financial markets are functionally oblivious to the people in the communities that are experiencing and living in this housing and the role that housing plays in individual and community well-being. So what we see, right, there's a lot of research on the typology of property owners and landlords, and one typology is called a milker, where we have people buying up property to then milk it for all it's worth. And in terms of milking, right, it is extracting. It is extracting, 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 and not putting anything back into that property or back into the community. So these are the systems that are letting the housing that is over our heads, that is over our community's heads, fall apart in a way, right? But those tenants are still paying the same amount of rent as their neighbor who might be in better position. And part of, right, extracting wealth is, in fact, not doing repairs, right? Repairs cost money. And so we see landlords refusing or ignoring to to make sure that their housing is quality. Um, and then we have, right, the just inherent uneven bargaining power between tenants and landlords. This is true for all tenants, and it is especially true and especially now for, anyone who is a member of some sort of marginalized population. Here we're focusing on our immigrant and undocumented communities, but it's true for, our LGBTQ communities. It's true for anyone who is, part of a historically marginalized population. That bargaining power between tenants and landlords is just deeply uneven. And what that means is that, right, leases and contracts are often not necessarily in the language of both parties who are parties to those contracts. Our community members signing without knowing the terms, illegal terms being put into contracts that, might not be upheld in court, but in the meantime, the tenant is following that, right? Or they're not getting something that they should be getting from their landlord and their housing provider. We see, misleading miscommunications between the parties. And then, sometimes we see instances, I would say this happens from the jump, but often, times our members experience is that maybe they get an annual lease upon moving into a property, but then afterwards they are forced onto a month-to-month lease, right? I think that if this hasn't been your experience before, you might think of a month-to-month lease as, something that like a young professional who's not sure how long they're going to stay somewhere. And so they want a month-to-month lease to be able to like leave and move if their job changes or whatever. I think that was kind of like historically the idea of month-to-month, or just like the common sense understanding. And that it might, be kind of a burden on the landlord or put them in a funny position if they're like not sure when their unit will be unoccupied. However, what we are seeing now increasingly is tenants being forced onto month-to-month leases. They want longer term stability and it is not being offered to them. And why is that happening? You know, because in Connecticut, we do not have just cause eviction protections. If you are a month-to-month tenant, at any given month, you can be pushed out for no cause, no fault of your own, right? Through the eviction process, through the non-renewal process. Um, and so we see landlords using this as a tool to unfairly, the month-to-month tenancy as a tool to be able to evict tenants without cause, to raise the rent at any rate, any time between those months. Um, and that gives the landlord more control over the tenant situation, and it makes the tenant in a more precarious and fearful position. We can go to the next slide. And then one after that, sorry. So, right, the system has a few different layers. We've got our municipal level where tenants are facing a number of barriers. We have lack of language justice at municipal council meetings, in accessing resources and accessing basic information. We have insufficient funding, staffing, and resourcing of our housing code enforcement. I think of working with Teresa and Make the Road. I'm thinking primarily of Hartford, but like this is true, for many municipalities across our state, and especially the regional ones where that can even get very confusing for a tenant to even know, who to call if their landlord is being unresponsive. And housing code enforcement, whatever department or regional department it's under, can be very confusing. And those municipalities that do have a local housing code enforcement, right? And this is not a knock on any individual person who's engaging in this work, because we have met some phenomenal and worked with like really great housing code enforcement inspectors, but it fundamentally is the system within their work that they're working within, right? There is not enough funding, they are overworked, understaffed, and there's just not enough resources to be able to, right, hold landlords accountable in the way that needs to be done. Which gets into the insufficient accountability for landlords. Right? There's very little accountability for landlords and very little accountability for repeat violators, right? If we have, right, if we are sending municipal inspectors and officials to the same unit over and over and over again, right, how is that possible, right? How is that fair? We've had to, it's been our experience, working with tenants that Make the Road, that in those repeat violation situations, as an advocate for the tenants, I have actively had to push for fines to be issued against the landlord. Why was that not being done automatically after the 9th, 10th violation, right? And there's been talk of public databases of this information to make it more accessible, to hold landlords more publicly accountable. That is often talked about, and it just the can gets kicked down the road. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and we still don't have it yet. If we're doing the work right, there are tools available to municipalities. If the landlord is not doing the work, right, there are ways in which a municipality can do the work themselves and then charge the landlord, put a lien on that property, And if the landlord doesn't end up paying, they can foreclose on that lien. There are available tools and they are just not being utilized. Um, and then, so parallel to the insufficient accountability for landlords is there's insufficient support for tenants. There's very few preventative resources for tenants experiencing housing instability, housing insecurity, and or displacement. And then this is high on my mind because we were just dealing with this, and we'll mention it again later. But in the once something happens, right? So there's few preventative resources, but then from, after something happens, for example, a fire, right? Municipalities have obligations under the Uniform Relocation Assistance Act to provide tenants support who are displaced by something like a fire. And we are just not seeing the systems in place to adequately support tenants in those situations. Um, and then finally, fair rent commissions, right? We have them. Many of them need to be trained up a little bit better. They need to be provided adequate resources so that there is communication between the commission and the tenant so that things run smoothly. And, in many cases, um, we're seeing really, really long backups in cases. So a tenant might file a complaint in April and not be heard till sometime in October. At the state level, we're seeing, again, a lack of language justice in our state courts, at the Capitol, across state agencies, lack of tenant protections codified in state laws, right? There is no rent stabilization in Connecticut. There is no just cause eviction protection for the vast majority of tenants. There's no right to repair for tenants. And then the tenant protections we do have codified in law can be quite difficult to uphold, right? There are many laws on, prohibited lease terms. There are caps on late fees. There are notice requirements for rent increases, but none of those contain a proactive enforcement mechanism, right? So there is no way for that to just be, right, wrong, or like no one's checking that. And then on the defensive side, right, tenants often need an attorney who can support them in asserting those rights, right? If a tenant says, hey, I don't like that lease term, right? Again, that circles back to that uneven bargaining power. Good luck trying to get it out, right? And then on the back end, if there's not enough support, then the tenant doesn't know that they can push back a little bit harder to say, no, I don't have to comply with that. And same thing with housing code and essential services that landlords are supposed to provide. It's just really difficult to uphold on a systemic level the way that the laws are written right now. Tenants have very little protection against unlawful conduct by landlords. And then lack of representation. So I think about this on a couple of different levels. One is like, shout out, Right to Counsel is doing phenomenal work, and the clients that they've worked with, they have done like really amazing job keeping them stable and helping them meet their housing goals in a time of crisis. But from a funding perspective and like a systemic perspective, it's just simply not enough. 88% of landlords are represented in eviction proceedings. Prior to Right to Counsel in Connecticut, on average, it was 7% of tenants. So we have 88% of landlords represented, 7% of tenants with representation in eviction court, right? And what is at stake for those two parties in that situation is vastly different. For the landlord, it is a dollar. For the tenant, it is the roof over their head. With Right to Counsel in the zip codes in which it's available, representation has increased from on average 6 to 7% to now 14%. So again, they've doubled it and they're doing amazing work, but 14% is still a massive, right, disparity between those two parties in what is such a high stakes scenario for the tenant. And make the road members' experience has been that mediators, right? When you go to eviction court, you first go to mediation. That mediators are actually really discouraging tenants to pursue their fight for justice in their situation, right? They are aiming to get a quick and fast resolution, which doesn't always move in favor of the tenant. And without representation, they can very easily be railroaded. Um, and then I also would like to flag that, tenants are not proportionally or adequately represented in our other branches of government. In the legislature, nearly 1 in 5 of Connecticut lawmakers are landlords. Um, and then on the federal level, right, our undocumented community members are not eligible for subsidized housing or any other federal benefits programs. So if you hear otherwise, that is inaccurate. They are not eligible for any federal benefits. Undocumented tenants cannot access state or local rent relief programs if those programs require a social security number, even if they're not requiring it necessarily, but they're asking for it, right? Then that is a chilling effect, and those folks are not going to access, especially in the current climate. And frankly, right, our federal government has failed to protect tenants and supply real affordable housing. They've ignored displacement and evictions and fundamentally sided with the corporate landlords over what is predominantly a renter and working class nation. And Teresa is going to speak a little bit more to some lived experiences factors that can affect housing stability within kind of that structural system.
As an organization who works with immigrants communities, of course, we see external factors that actually very similar to our more disenfranchised communities and marginalized communities. But if one of the parents in dual income household is deported, because we have been seeing many people kidnapped from the street and destroying families, and they are being detained by ICE and can provide for their share of expenses, including rent. This can have significant effects on the families. One story, I will say is not just once, once there are many now, is that here led to the family having to move out and rent a single room for her and her 2 kids because they could no longer afford to pay for a whole home. Several of other immigrants live in this house. So that means, and she was telling me their story, and they have to take turns and to go to the bathroom or to use the kitchens. And not everybody can live in this kind of collective housing, but they are trying to survive. Then I hear another mother who actually wasn't working when they kidnapped her husbands, and she was living in a very uninhabitable basement, and she was paying very high bills and electricity. And the landlord says, oh, because your husband is not here anymore, you have to leave the basement because you won't be able to pay. So they don't, many people in my community don't know what their rights are. And that is when we are pleased to work with our community when they come to us and says, this is what has happened to me. And we start working with Connecticut Fair Housing Center for them, because we want to keep every single person under a roof. And that is how they impoverish our women in this country. And this is real stories that it's happening here in Connecticut. There are many autonomous mothers who are survivors of domestic violence who are undocumented as well. This results in job instability and thus economic insecurity for the whole family. They are exploited in terms of housing. I hear a story last year from a mother who actually was autonomous, and she suffered from domestic violence. And at some point, she didn't have money to pay her rent. And the abusive landlord was trying to get extra favors for her to pay her rent. And we need to talk about this because it's happening. And probably you will surprise that this is happening here, but it is. So that means that our communities are always are they have been like violating their human rights constantly here. Crises such as the pandemic or economic difficulties exacerbate this situation. During times like this, they cannot afford to stop working. The crisis may limit the availability of childcare. They often have to cut costs to not lose their homes. And sometimes they have just to take like jobs that are very underpaid because they need in some way to pay everything, right? Rent and their bills. And for a mother to have a childcare later at night is completely difficult. And sometimes this kind of um, situations criminalize our mothers, and actually they are trying to survive like many others in this city. And let me go to the next slide. And I will pass it to Chelsea.
So yeah, just to summarize up, these like layers of common issues that we're seeing for tenants. Teresa talked about at the beginning the difficulty of even getting into an apartment, or if you're in a bad situation, trying to find a new situation. And we're seeing, right, tenant screening on factors that aren't taking into consideration individualized circumstances. We're seeing increased use of AI and like software by landlords, which just like completely dehumanizes the process. Maybe someone's credit score isn't great, but it's because of like historical factors and they're in a better place now, but that might not be reflected in this, screening report that gets spit out, that a landlord might just take a quick look at and say like, not good enough. Right? There's not that human to human connection of like someone is looking for housing. It is just turned into this like, business where a tenant is equivalent to a widget, and it just appears on a piece of paper. More insidious than that is like some factors of tenant screening have a discriminatory effect, right? Disparate impact based on, criminal record screening, or, asking for certain information that might flag them as, a particular race or gender or sexual orientation. Just the generalized economic instability, right? What Teresa mentioned about, single income households, how immigration status affects economic instability, how, what we saw in the government shutdown and people's, SNAP benefits not necessarily being accessible. There is a common phrase that the rent eats first. And so people are giving up other necessities just to keep a roof over their head. The overall, lack of substantive and enforceable tenant protections, the failure to adequately regulate our financialized housing market, both the cost on the tenant and the conditions in which they're living. And then housing, right, is deeply intersectional, and there's all these other intersectional issues that, mutually impact someone's housing situation, such as domestic violence, the lack of universal access to affordable childcare, which factors into the economic instability element, other forms of discrimination. Whether that is in employment, right? So it's harder for someone to get a job because of discrimination. It's not just happening in the housing sector. Our broken immigration system, right? Why are folks undocumented? Because we are using the same immigration system that we have centuries ago. And then, right, that generalized kind of systemic oppression and what results from that. And connected to that closely is our lack of language justice. I'll pass it back to Teresa.
I always
You're
forget
muted.
myself. Yes. Now that we know our common issue, because it's like we talked before, many issues that our undocumented communities suffer is like many people in our marginalized communities are going through. Sometimes we don't have that connections because we have the lack of language justice. The first meetings that we have with our community in Hartford, we actually have language justice, and we noticed that a it was a different way of handling meeting, because of course they connect, they understand that they were fighting the same fight. And we should own and honor our desire to fight for a human right. We should organize and fight for change and for agency. We should dream together and make everything possible for all of us, regardless of our immigration status. And this is because La Vivienda Social Verde or Green Social Housing is a collective dream that many of us has been trying to accomplish little by little. We have been fighting all these years for many things that we're going to talk in a couple of slides. I don't know if Victor entered, Danielle.
I still don't see him. I'll keep an eye out.
Yeah, because that's what is the part that he gonna try to present. He answered to me and says that he couldn't connect it. So I sense we'll see if he can connect it.
Okay.
But this is the story, and hopefully Victor can answer like right now. But we have been like organizing this building of 24 units. It was here in Wethersfield Avenue, and we started like 3 years ago when one of our members from Make the Road, Connecticut, we have a workshop talking about gentrifications, and we gave a couple of clues that they have to be alert when there seems people or other buildings or houses around their neighbors, like they were like selling, or the something has been changing around them, and if the landlords will be a new landlord, they have to be alert if they're going to increase their rent. And then one of our wonderful members came to us and says, "Hey, Teresa, I think something's going on in my building, and they are increasing our rent for $400." And that is when all their neighbors get together and says, "We can't afford this." And this was after um, the um, the COVID. So many of them were autonomous mothers. Many of them were immigrants. Just one was bilingual, all the other was Spanish speaker. So, and they decide to unionize and says, okay, we have to be together. So they start fighting together, and we discover many issues in our way to find justice. And that is when we start working very close with Connecticut Fair Housing Center, because we discovered that many forms where they can complain to the city about the way that they were living. There wasn't any um, reason why they have to increase $400, because the conditions that they were living in this building was incredible bad. So we start noticing that any forms in the city of Hartford were in Spanish. So we work in community with Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and we help our community, and they could like complain about the issues. Then we use all the tools that the city wise gave us, and we actually bring the landlord to the court, and they won. They won in court. They returned some amount of money from the rent that they have been paying in court. And this time was against Alpha Capital, who actually is having some issue in London right now as well, with other tenants trying to do the same thing. And these wonderful tenants were very, very united, and they were like fighting for 3 years. But sadly, like 2 weeks ago, in October 30th, one of the buildings, because there's a twin building, one of the building with 12 units caught fire. So many people who was union in the union was displaced, and they have been like living in nightmares since then. And we have been like walking with them and knowing all these kind of disparities that they have to live when they lose everything. And of course, the city didn't enough for them. They probably thinks they did, but they know very clearly that the resources that we have in the community and the municipality is from the people, and they thinks that they deserve better on the way that they have been treating since the fires happened. And I wish I could honor this. I want just to say that I feel very, very proud to have been working with these wonderful leaders. Hopefully, Victor will be able to talk a little bit more about this, but there were many others who were like fighting and still fighting. We are having meetings with them every Wednesday now because they want their necessity to be covered. They have kids. They are tenants. They are humans. When we talk about tenants, we don't talk about things. We are talking about people, and this is not um, an object. They are families. There are kids involved, and that's why I want to honor these wonderful leaders. And I will pass it to the next. And that's why we want green social housing. And our green social housing should be, I'm sorry, it should be owned by the people. I'm sorry, I don't know what I did. It should be socially owned by public entities like city, housing authority. Is this our view? We have been talking about this with with the tenants in Weathersfield and other people who actually reorganize, because there is not just one building. There are actually other people who are like trying to live in better conditions. And we are talking about this stream, right? Owned by public entity, cities, housing authorities, county, state, or federal government, tenants, or mission-driven nonprofits such as cooperative and community land trusts. I will talk a little bit about land trusts because my grandfather in Bolivia in 1952 passed a law in Bolivia that they ordered that the land should be for the people who wants to work on it. So my grandfather worked in this land for his entire life and feed his family his entire life with other community members, including indigenous communities. And all the decisions have to be taken by them. And this is something, a visions that we have that it should be in community land trust, and hopefully we can have more time to talk about this. And it should be permanently affordable to everyone, even the lowest income residents, including residents with no income. It should be deeply affordable. No social housing resident should be paid over 30% of their income on housing costs. Right now, many people in our community are paying 1,600, and nobody can afford that. And I was asking one of our community member how many hours he have to pay to leave yesterday, and he says that he has been like working 14 hours a day. I don't think this is human. That's when we start dishumanizing a community, and that's why we need permanently affordable. Permanently commodified, like we talked before, and now the housing is treated as a commodity, protect from non-profit investors and the speculative market. It must never be resolved for profit. It should be treated as human needs, not a commodity to provide profit to landlord or investors. It should be under community control, develop, own, manage, and operate in a way that is accountable to residents, the community, and the public. Residents should have a direct role in management and decision-making, including through tenant union. Anti-racist and equitable, designed to promote racial and gender equity and end the displacements of community of colors. Immigration status and criminal records should not disqualify people from residence. Social housing should be planned to advance to access of marginalized community to greater social and economic opportunity by equalizing these resources across geography. And I will pass it to Gabriela Moncada, a wonderful leader of our community in Mexico, Connecticut. Gabriela.
Sí, ya está. Ah, mi nombre es Gabriela Moncada. Soy miembro líder de May the Road y estoy aquí para compartir una manera que la gente en mi país, Honduras, lucha por viviendas accesibles utilizando terrenos públicos y privados. Esto pasa porque no existen viviendas dignas y las familias tienen derecho a un terreno, a una vivienda. La comunidad en Honduras se reúne en grupos de personas sin vivienda y se organizan mucho más. Además, buscan a funcionarios públicos que apoyen iniciativas y que esas personas den información de los terrenos accesibles como en abandono, sin utilizar y terrenos públicos o privados que tienen deudas como los taxes. Cuando descubren cuál es el terreno que es el indicado, eh, descubren que es esos terrenos, ahí en esos terrenos van muchas personas haciendo sus viviendas, hacen un reporte con respecto a ese terreno. Cuando hacen el reporte, en caso de que sean públicos, se llevan a consensos y el grupo de personas deciden tomar el terreno porque el terreno público es del pueblo y si hay una necesidad, se debe dar prioridad a la gente que la necesita. Mientras estos procesos están en vigencia y son negociados, las familias tienen que habitar de alguna manera en estos terrenos o si no los pierden y se designan a otras familias que también lo están necesitando y pierden lo aportado. Además, no todas las familias califican, solo pueden acceder a esta vivienda, a estos terrenos, personas que no tienen vivienda o no tienen ninguna propiedad. Antes de hacer la repartición, se forman el patronato. En Honduras le llaman patronato, que es una directiva de representantes. Ellos son los que negocian con la población, población y con el Estado, cuando son terrenos del Estado. Se mide todo el terreno, cuentan las familias y se hacen tres tipos de cálculos. Cuando hacen estos tipos de cálculos, definen. Luego se lleva un consenso nuevamente. Entre ellos tienen que haber terrenos para las calles, avenidas, instalaciones públicas. Dejan terrenos para iglesia, escuela y un centro comunitario. Después de hacer estas medidas, se reparten de acuerdo a las familias que se organizaron para tomar el terreno público. Al principio los pobladores, para no perder estos terrenos, arman sus viviendas como campamentos temporales o casitas de madera. Y luego el patronato negocia con el Estado y este proceso puede durar mucho tiempo. Y cuando concluyen con la construcción se adecúa para que los pobladores puedan tener una vivienda digna. La comunidad paga al tesorero del patronato semanalmente para poder cubrir los gastos de negociación, viajes de los representantes y se necesita abogados, también sirve para pagar a ellos. Cuando sobra dinero, se ahorra para fondos comunes, para construir las áreas colectivas e instalaciones de agua potable, electricidad, escuelas y avenidas. Luego de conseguir el terreno, se consigue aportando al fondo común para el mantenimiento de las áreas comunes. Las viviendas son construidas y pagadas por cada familia de Honduras. De esa manera, muchas familias pueden acceder a tener una vivienda y se puede vivir en comunidades, pero por supuesto no es suficiente y la población sigue organizándose para poder acceder a estos terrenos.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela.
Gracias, no sé, Tere, ¿quién sigue?
Yeah. I will call Miguel Arenas, who's going to talk about sustainability.
Hi. Okay, so I'll get a move on this, but just like from the get-go, just defining um, sustainable housing. Uh, it's built using green construction methods according to the principles of energy efficient design. And it should include the renovation and sustainable rehabilitation of existing buildings. So this doesn't mean just building more housing, it means repurposing what's already there for energy efficiency and disaster resilience. Then on the next slide, perfect. So it also should be high quality and built to last. So it's not just replacing the materials every year, but it is making sure that it's high quality so that people can live a high quality life. And it should be accessible to all people, regardless of age, physical need, or other factors. And now just thinking more broadly about like sustainability in Hartford is a case study because I did kind of like a case study research project a couple years back that focused on Hartford and thinking about sustainability and environmental concerns. So there are many energy inefficient homes that contribute to urban heat islands, which is when like certain areas in an urban landscape are much hotter than others, causing poor air quality and often leading to mass displacement due to electrical fires. Then the Connecticut River and other surrounding watersheds, which is where people get their water from. The water from there is processed and used in various ways. So the Connecticut River watershed is in many locations polluted, especially those next to major highways like there are going into Hartford and out of Hartford. So water is regularly contaminated by runoff containing dangerous oils, road salts, and fertilizers, which is not great. And then the air quality, which was mentioned with the energy inefficiency and the heat islands, is also just like affected by like certain industrial areas in Hartford or in urban areas in general, often have a lot more aerial pollutants that increases the risk of asthma in nearby residents. And that's especially true in some neighborhoods, which I'll go into. And finally, urban food deserts, which it's different for rural areas, but in urban areas, it's when food is an hour or more, like fresh food is an hour or more away from where someone lives. So they would have to travel an hour or more in order to like access quality food, like fresh produce. So it's not just like you don't have a good grocery store in your neighborhood. There's many instances of this, just in many urban areas, but in Hartford also. And the next one. So going into environmental justice as a social issue, so like environmental issues overall disproportionately affect low-income communities with people from marginalized backgrounds, namely immigrants and people of color. So electrical fires, which have already been mentioned in other sections, often occur in low-income communities, which leads to displacement and further financial instability, plus personal loss. So I don't know how many have read this report that came out in the CT Mirror, which is about the Wethersfield Avenue fire that happened recently. But in it like there's many very moving interviews by tenants who had to leave their home and had to leave behind a lot of like personal things that just can't be replaced. So that's also in addition to just like being displaced. It's an emotional and a mental loss. And then historically red line neighborhoods, um, which is like a big contributor to urban discrimination, are often urban food deserts. So, looking at these maps right here, this is a red line map from the 1930s, beside a map comparing average household incomes in Hartford. And you can see a lot of the more low-income neighborhoods fall within the red or yellow categories. Um, so for reference, the redlining was a practice that originated in the 1930s, and it was meant to discriminate on the basis of race and ethnicity, um, to deny certain residents mortgages, loans, or insurance. And it was a discriminatory practice, and it's still the effects of that are being felt today, especially in environmental housing issues. Um, and finally, the air quality issues. So air is thick, it's contaminated, and in heat islands, which it has consequences like asthma and other respiratory diseases, and which are statistically more common among low-income people of color, in Connecticut and in other places. But yeah. The next slide. Okay, so kind of looking forward on how we can go towards or construct a greener future through sustainable housing. You think about, again, renovating old buildings, so recycling what's already there, but improving it to be more energy efficient, using sustainable and recycled materials that are high quality and lasting, and eco-friendly. So toxic materials, a lot of these old buildings also just like have not been checked for toxic materials that are known carcinogens. So making sure we replace those, uh, not only because like they affect the natural environment, but also just the quality of life of the people that live in the buildings, which are often intertwined. And then uh, investing in green spaces does a lot for um, just producing fresh, like there's fresh produce, makes it more accessible. So in urban food deserts, this is a way to combat it, and to reduce urban heat islands. The presence of greenery helps like make it more cool in areas that are mostly concrete. The heat tends to collect, and that leads to the poor air quality, but also the greenery can help filter the air. Then holding corporations and the government responsible for air and water pollution, as well as like making sure that like we advocate for funding for all these renovations, and just like hold them accountable when they fall short, which is a lot of the time. And then another thing is to encourage group and collaborative living. So this reduces resource consumption and energy use and increases affordability. So this is like communal living can also mean contributing to these green spaces together as like a community and taking kind of a collective approach to sustainability. Uh, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michaela. Well, and we for all of this dream, we actually want security with tenant security, operate within a set of practice that protect tenants from evictions and displacements, such as rents regulations that we have been fighting a couple years ago, and just cause of protections that we still fighting right now, right to counsel, right to organize, and more. And I will pass it to my friend Chelsea now.
Yeah, so I know we're just over time, so I won't get into detail with all this, but we wanted to put out there, that at the beginning, we were focused on a lot of the issues, but these issues have solutions. And it really is going to be us as tenants, as residents who care about our community, as housing advocates pushing for these. We are not, right? No one is going to give us this. We need to get organized and push for these things together. All of the, suggested policy changes and, in terms of funding and investing, infrastructure and regulation that are up on this slide, they are research backed. They are being implemented in other states, localities, or countries, and keeping communities, right, stable, keeping housing affordable for our communities. So I won't get too much into it, but that is where we wanted to end, is to say, like, there are solutions and it will take us together to figure out what is going to work for Connecticut and fight for that.
Thank you, Chelsea. And for this reason, we are here presenting together because we believe in this dream, because it's our collective goal, our collective freedom. And thank you very much for being here and listening to us.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you at some of the other sessions we've got planned for this afternoon. Maybe see you at our reception tonight. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. I'm sorry we weren't able to get Victor in on the conversation. We'll get him next time. Thanks a ton, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one.